Hello, welcome back to Ethics and Archaeology. This is week 5. I know, how did we get here? It feels like we were just starting not too long ago, but very glad to see you. Thank you to everybody who commented their thoughts about last week when we talked about archaeology's role in the media. It was really interesting to see your thoughts about what parts of media inspired you to be interested in archaeology and how you see them now. Um, Obviously, it's very hard to look back on stuff that meant a lot to us at one time with a kind of different lens, but I think it's always important to do, especially if it's our field or it's something that we're very passionate about. So, thank you to everyone who engaged in that. It's a very cold day today in Melbourne, so I'm just going to be holding my cup of tea here while we talk about the role of modern religion. So, in our final 2 weeks, we're going to be talking about religion this week and then politics next week. And that's not because I want to condemn any kind of religious or political beliefs, but it's exclusively because archaeology is never objective. And we need to talk about some of the ways in which our own personal perspectives can influence our interpretations of archaeology. So, before I get into what I want to talk about with you guys today, I just need to do a little bit of housekeeping. Firstly, in order to get your certificate to say that you've done this subject, you need to have completed a couple of criteria, which I assume that most of you already have, just based on what I've been looking at already. So the thing that I've decided that you need to do to pass the subject isn't a big thing. You just need to have responded to 2 of the weekly questions that I've put up. And I mean 2 in the overall course, not like 2 per week. That's way too much. I don't know what's going on in your life. I'm not going to kind of put that burden on you. So just 2 of the weekly questions from any of the weeks, and I'll just go through and have a look who's done that when we finish the course, or a week or so after we finish the course, so you have some time to go through. Preferably, I'd love if you could respond to other people's comments as well as giving your own thoughts, because like I've illustrated a number of times in this course, the learning that you're going to get out of this is only enhanced by engaging with the other people in your cohort and expressing your ideas and responding and thinking about other people's ideas. Honestly, you're going to learn much more from speaking to other people than you ever will from any kind of book or listening to anybody talk at length about whatever the subject is. That personal engagement is super important, and I'm really glad that people have already jumped on that bandwagon with me, so thank you. So that's the first point. The second thing is that I've been asked by the powers that be, aka the people who run this non-for-profit, to organise a kind of end of class graduation kind of collage. So I'll be posting a submission point. I think I can do that in some description on the Google Classroom. A submission point for you to pop in a photo of yourself doing anything historical or archaeological. So that could be you at an excavation or a museum, or holding a trowel like this one in the photo if you haven't done one, holding a history book, or wearing some kind of archaeology inspired outfit, or photoshopping the pyramids behind you, just anything that kind of makes you look like you're doing something archaeological, just so we have a little bit of a fun collage to put together of all of our faces to remember the graduating class of ethics in archaeology for 2020. I just think it'll be really fun, and I hope you get around that. Obviously, no pressure if you don't feel comfortable doing that. Yes, so I think that's all I needed to talk to you about. Yes, no, let's go. Let's get into it. So today we're going to mostly be talking about biblical archaeology, not because of any kind of personal religious beliefs or anything. I'm an atheist, but just because it has the most impact on the history of archaeology up until this point. We're also going to be talking about the use of other religious texts in archaeology, just very briefly. And then the main part of this is going to be talking about the internal and external challenges of incorporating religious belief into archaeology. And by internal and external, I mean internal to the field of archaeology and external in the other impacts on archaeology from other sources. And then we're going to be talking about some things that we can be doing in the future to kind of assist or work through some of the difficulties associated with this for everybody involved. So, biblical archaeology, why are we talking about it in such depth? Mostly because biblical archaeology and the way that it was pursued in the 19th century had a big impact on archaeology as a field. So, biblical archaeology was mostly driven by European Christians in the 19th century, and I promise I'm not going to start talking about the Grand Tour again. I'm not going to put you through it. So, all links to that, the kind of privilege and economic wealth that was generated in Europe at the time lent the ability for people to search out the Holy Land, their Holy Land as per their religious text, and try to link sites in the Bible such as the place where Noah's Ark landed, or a range of different things from both the Old and the New Testament, to physical locations, essentially. So this was mostly funded by philanthropists, which are rich aristocratic people who have money to spend on excavations, which is cool, I guess, and also European governments, which is, still something that lends itself to archaeology today. So, for example, the Palestine Exploration Fund was established in 1965 with Queen Victoria of England listed as the patron of this. This fund evolved into a number of different things, including Syro-Palestinian archaeology, Holy Land archaeology, and archaeology of the southern Levant. So the way this was pursued was not super scientific. Essentially anything that kind of looked like it dated to biblical times was attached to a biblical story, even if it does not correlate exactly, or even if there is contrasting evidence that was kind of overlooked. And that's why I wanted to mention that, because this early archaeology took a while to become quite scientific, and having a bias towards wanting to find something kind of led to confirmation bias, where people assumed what they had found was what they were looking for. So we see a similar thing in other uses of archaeology for religious purposes, just not as extensively for a number of different reasons. So we have Islamic archaeology to investigate the Quran and the number of sites and figures and movements and events that happen in the Quran. Also Vedic archaeology for Hindu religions. The list goes on and on. Essentially every religious text that exists has been used in archaeology to some degree, but the reason I'm not expanding on that as heavily is that it was less pervasive into archaeology as a discipline than biblical archaeology. So, why is this a challenge? So, firstly, it's difficult to talk about religious text and archaeology, the interplay between the two, without talking about other approaches to archaeology that have used text to kind of guide excavation and interpretation. So, for example, Schliemann and his approach to Troy is something that we need to be really critical of. So essentially, Heinrich Schliemann, I think I've talked about this before, but essentially Heinrich Schliemann used the Iliad to kind of guide his excavation of the city of Troy, and essentially ended up destroying a whole bunch of different layers of stratigraphy as he pursued the particular part. I think it's Troy 14 or something, like the 14th layer, that correlated more closely to the Iliad and the events of that. So we really need to be learning from that and remembering that even if we do have a text, we need to approach archaeology in more of a scientific way, and if there are correlations, let the correlations speak for themselves. So instead of going out pursuing something that's in a text, instead pursuing things for scientific reasons, and if they do happen to correlate to the text, because they just do, because those are the facts, then we can start talking about similarities. So, learning from our own history and hopefully doing better in future and not destroying a whole bunch of different layers of stratigraphy is one challenge that archaeology has in its pursuit of using religious beliefs. So that's one important thing. Obviously, I'm not suggesting that the biblical archaeology or the religious archaeology excavations that happen today are in danger of doing what Schliemann did in terms of the sheer amount of destruction. People pursue biblical archaeology today and obviously other religious archaeology in very scientific, respectful ways, but I think it is just something that I wanted to flag because it's something that we need to be mindful of. Yes, so the other thing we need to do is work at balancing our respect for religious belief, particularly Indigenous religious and cultural beliefs, with our scientific approaches. So I've spoken already about ethnoarchaeology and things like that. I think archaeology and archaeologists tend to kind of err on the side of science these days, and the scientific method. And that is a good thing, but it's also a little bit dismissive of other perspectives, and particularly religious or cultural perspectives, which contrast strongly to the archaeologist's own thoughts. So we need to really work at finding a healthy balance between acknowledging and respecting religious and cultural beliefs. Again, Indigenous beliefs are particularly important in this regard because of a number of different histories of dispossession and cultural massacre, all of the above. So we need to work at that. We also need to work at finding a middle ground between engaging people in archaeology through expressing that, perhaps this correlates with a religious text, and also being mindful that saying things like that can promote particular narratives and spread misinformation. So essentially what I mean by this is that people who have particular religious inclinations may potentially be more interested in archaeology if it does appear that a recent discovery correlates to something that they're already passionate about, which is totally fine and reasonable. And I think we do need to communicate our ideas, especially if it does seem like potentially there are correlations between text and archaeological remains. But in doing so, we need to be very mindful of the fact that some people will use this information in a non-scientific way to promote particular beliefs that they have, especially over the ownership of land and the history of a particular place. So those are some of the internal challenges. Very easy, isn't it? And some of the external challenges are equally, if not more, difficult to work through and work together through. So firstly, a bias in funding is still prominent. A lot of people use, similarly to what I was just saying, a lot of people use the notion that a site may yield interesting, historically relevant and religiously relevant facts, I guess. I don't know. Some people might suggest that something is important in terms of religious text as well as scientifically in order to garner more funding. And I'm sure there are certain governmental or non-governmental funding bodies who would lean more towards funding an excavation or a project of any kind which has the potential for providing more, I guess, yeah, just supporting particular beliefs, I guess is what I wanted to say. So that's something we need to work towards, is having more equal and unbiased funding for excavations or museums or whatever. The other thing is that contrasting notions of the same sites, historically or archaeologically or material, can lead to large disputes and not funding, and violence in some in some instances. So we need to be careful about the narratives that we promote, and yeah, just again trying to balance our respect for religious beliefs when we're talking about archaeology, so as to not promote these kind of difficult conflicts between different religious beliefs and sects of religious beliefs. The other thing is that sometimes religion is tied up with nationalism. We're going to talk about this more next week when we talk about politics and archaeology and religion as well, which can all kind of come together in a nice little bow. Sometimes, if we promote particular interpretations of an archaeological site, that can really feed into a nationalist belief of, again, ownership of land or, historical ownership as well, I guess, which can be damaging if there are a number of different minorities living in a particular space. And unfortunately, I do have to mention this. Obviously, this does not pertain to all religious beliefs and all religious people, but in some instances, we do see destruction as a result of extremist belief. For example, ISIS's destruction of Palmyra and a number of different sites throughout Syria and Iraq. It's a tragic thing to have to talk about, and I don't want to get into it in detail because it's a little bit beside the point, because it is obviously extremism. It is not the norm, but it is something that needs to be mentioned and talked about. So, how do we go about moving forward with this and making sure that archaeology is a little bit more balanced in its approach to religion and its use of religious discourse? The way I see it, there are kind of three options. Firstly, more representation of different religious inclinations within archaeology. If we seek to be a little bit more balanced in the number of different experts who have different political and religious inclinations, perhaps that will give us more diversity and more interesting ideas, because, like I've said, the more conflicting and diverse ideas you have, the more likely you're going to be able to interpret a site correctly, because obviously having one perspective is not necessarily the closest to the ancient perspective, if that makes sense. The other thing is less use of religious discourse in archaeology. This is something that I think a lot of scientifically minded archaeologists would lean towards, but it's not necessarily the best way, because there is a third option, which is more collaboration and multidisciplinary approaches to archaeology. So again, taking in different perspectives and different accounts of archaeology, different interpretations through a religious and a scientific lens at the same time. But as always, what you think is most important. I don't feel like the best person to be talking about this because I'm not religious myself. But if you are, I'd really love to hear what you think about this. And if you're not, I would still like to hear what you think about this because obviously it's very important for us to be having these open discussions so that we can really work to finding out the best. I guess just finding the best method moving forward for archaeology on the whole. But again, it's probably going to be a case by case basis type thing. So thank you for tuning in. I look forward to talking to you next week about religion. No, that's this week, about politics for our final week. Super strange that we're at the end. But yeah, thank you so much. Have a great day. Take care of yourself and your loved ones, and I'll see you next week.